Apologies, everyone, and welcome back. So as Adrian explained, I'm just going to be going through basically the disclosure data and trends, both globally and locally, as they relate to the TCFD framework. Yeah, I'm going to try to be quick without sort of taking away from presenting anything meaningful. So yeah, so if maybe I'm moving too fast or there's bits that are sort of just rushed over that you'd like me to repeat or whatever, please let me know. Yeah, so I'll just start. So Saren has already laid out the groundwork on the TCFD as well as its objectives and aims. So my job basically, as I said before, is just to take you through some of the climate reporting trends that we have observed, specifically as they relate to the TCFD framework. So this first slide just shows a summary of the TCFD related statistics as determined by the Financial Stability Board, or the task force actually. So in the interest of time, I won't get into too much detail, but you will be able to find all of this information by following all the links that are sort of here on the slides. And if I'm not mistaken, these slides will be shared with everyone. So yeah, so all I want to draw your attention to in this slide is just the graph on the left, which just shows the annual increase in the number of organizations which have officially expressed their support for the recommendations in 2017 and up to the end of the first quarter of 2021. So as you can see, there's sort of been a modest increase between sort of the 2018 and 2019 years, which then shot up in 2020. So this is just, if you look also at the 2021 year, which is basically just the first quarter, if we can sort of make our estimations, it's probably likely that over a thousand organizations will, sorry, I just saw something in the chat, so I quickly checked, but it's just Adrian. So we're looking at possibly over 1,000 already by the end of this year, sort of becoming formal supporters of the TCFD framework. So just a note here that just when we're talking about formal support, we're speaking specifically about sort of an organization's commitment to work towards its own implementation of the recommendations, and not necessarily that they will be disclosing according to every sort of one of the pillars. So in October of last year, we had a TCFD status report that was released. So these 9 blocks that you see on the screen currently just show some of the key takeaways and findings from the status report. I won't go into too much detail on all of them, but I just want to take you through some of the ones that I found interesting. So the first is just that nearly 60% of the world's 100 largest public companies support the TCFD, report in line with the TCFD recommendations, or do both. So nearly 700 organizations have become TCFD supporters since the task force issued its 2019 status report, which is an increase of over 85%. The second thing that I sort of found interesting is just the disclosure of climate-related financial information has increased since 2017, but continuing progress is needed. So the disclosure of TCFD-aligned information has increased by around 6% on average between 2017 and 2019, but companies' disclosure of the potential financial impact of climate change on their businesses and strategies remains low. And I think a sort of point that's related to this one is so 1 in 15 companies or 1 in the 15 companies that were reviewed disclosed information on the resilience of their strategies. So in this review, it was just found that the percentage of companies disclosing the resilience of their strategies, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, was significantly lower than that of any other sort of recommended disclosure, which is kind of it's consistent with the findings of some of the research that we have conducted. But I'll discuss that a little later. And another point that is interesting, or I guess relevant for today's session, is just so asset manager and asset owner reporting to their clients as well as beneficiaries is insufficient or likely insufficient. So there is sort of TCFD aligned reporting by a sample of asset managers, or the reporting by sort of the sample of asset managers and asset owners has increased over the past 3 years. The task force is of the strong opinion that this type of reporting is not necessarily sufficient, and more progress would probably be needed to be made just to ensure that beneficiaries have the right information to make the sort of financial decisions. And just another sort of interesting point for me was that most expert users find sort of the impact of climate change on a company's business and strategy as the most useful for decision making. So it has just been noted that the information that companies share on their material climate-related issues for each sector and geography, as well as the key metrics that they use in this regard, is extremely useful for financial decision-making. So just again, all of these findings, as well as the status reports, you can find on the TCFD's website. So we know that companies have been steadily ramping up their climate-related disclosure, but what are some of the drivers of this disclosure? So the acceleration in the voluntary support for the TCFD recommendations has been spurred by public pressure, which I guess is not too surprising, as well as policy progress, which is aimed at transitioning to low carbon economies. So regulators and governments around the world are increasingly under pressure to sort of introduce mandatory requirements for the disclosure of climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And this is, disclosure is only likely to accelerate more as more and more governments start to announce that that disclosing in line with the TCFD recommendations will become mandatory. And this is already sort of evident by the increasing number of countries that have indicated their intent on making climate-related disclosures mandatory. This includes so countries like the UK, New Zealand, and the G7 countries. They've already started making moves on making disclosure mandatory. So it's not a question of if, but rather sort of when. But in addition to this, the 5 global sustainability, ESG, and integrated reporting framework and standard setting organizations, so that's the GRI, the CDP, Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the International Integrated Reporting Council, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, have set out their intention to sort of work together to create an international sustainability standards board, which would become sort of the global standard for reporting in a similar vein to the current global standard that we have for accounting. So as TCFD aligned disclosure accelerates in jurisdictions around the world, it's becoming clear that South African companies will need to do the same if they wish to remain competitive in attracting international investment and or just sort of satisfy international climate disclosure requirements when operating in other disclosure or in other jurisdictions where they may also be listed. So I think sort of for the local front, I think this is sort of the more interesting bit, or what I guess everyone here would care more about. So I'll just start off with the very first project that we sort of did that related to climate related disclosures. And this was a report, which is called The Emerging Importance of the TCFD Framework for South African Companies and Investors, which was research that was conducted by us, the Six Capitals team, as well as the WWF SA Sustainable Finance team. And this project, or this research project, was basically done with the intention of or the objective of this was just to sort of understand where South African companies and investors are at or were at the time, sort of with along the journey of sort of TCFD, as well as like the take up. And it was just basically to get a sense of what's happening, what's the South African landscape where the TCFD framework is involved. So this basically was done in the form of just a lot of, well, I guess you could call them interviews, but it felt more like sort of conversations that were recorded um, between many sort of many different stakeholders within sort of the economy. So this would be listed companies, investors, and this would, by investors, we're talking everyone from asset managers, retirement funds, you know, everyone that you can think of. And like I said, it was just done with the intention of figuring out where um, each of these different parties are along the journey of the TCFD. So just in general, in broad terms, some of the findings was that there has been a lot of progress that has been made by sort of investors and reporters in the recent years. But sort of from what we found is just that reporters sort of are leading the pack, but investors may still have to do just a bit more work in terms of sort of getting to grips with the recommendations. And this is especially true with, I think, we found with the more quantitative aspects of calculating climate risk. But, so generally we found that sort of South African reporters, they have made good progress on the more qualitative pillars of the TCFD framework. But this is mostly because most of this was already sort of covered in reporting historically. Yeah, so the second project, which forms part of sort of the workshops that we are having now, this was the fact sheet project. So these are the fact sheets that you would have sort of had the time to look through, but because we are pressed, you didn't get to. But like Adrian and Melanie already sort of recommended, it's definitely a good idea to look through them because we worked really hard on them. But there's a lot of sort of interesting information that you can find in there, particularly where sort of the TCFD framework or the TCFD disclosures are sort of related. So just to summarize how the project worked is we did research on sort of the top 50 or 50 rather, 50 of the largest JSE listed companies. Just or how we did this is we would basically just look through each of the recommendations of the 11 recommendations and see how each of those companies sort of disclose according to each of the recommendations. Just to once again deepen sort of our understanding of where South African companies are at, where TCFD or where climate related disclosure is involved. So within these fact sheets, we found that the local corporate reporters that were listed were lagging behind sort of the international counterparts in disclosing basically their climate risk exposure. But we do know that South Africa has a reputation for being one of the best integrated reporting regions in the world. So we may be sort of lagging out local peers, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we are sort of among the worst reporters in where climate related disclosure is involved. I'd say we are at least performing moderately well, those 50 largest companies. Just another note is that in our analysis, we saw that climate related disclosures are actually more widespread than we sort of had expected, based off of the sort of number of organizations that are formally sort of that are formal signatories of the TCFD, because on the website we have only sort of between now it's 18. So at the time that we did the research, there were only 13, but now as of August they were sort of 18. So we were surprised to find that sort of there were a lot more companies that were reporting sort of with TCFD aligned climate related sort of disclosure than we had anticipated. But this week we attributed some of this to sort of the CDP just playing a role in this, because so 2/3 of the companies that we assessed, they reported against the CDP sort of disclosure framework, and sort of the CDP themselves had already they had already stated that 25 of the questions that were in the 2019 questionnaire are aligned with the TCFD. So it only stands to reason that that companies that were already or that had completed the CDP questionnaire had better TCFD sort of disclosure overall. But we also found, or specifically the pillars that we sort of found were or the pillars that we found were sort of the better performers from the companies disclosing against the CDP framework, where governance, sort of dealing with the risks and opportunities strategy, as well as targets and the sort of emissions elements. But even though even though sort of there was a close alignment, I guess, between sort of disclosing CDP and having sort of TCFD aligned disclosure, there's still sort of a lot more work that needs to be done, where sort of the more quantitative aspects of disclosure are involved. But like I said initially, sort of our findings just show that the TCFD alignment journey, or the hurdle for companies in starting the TCFD alignment journey, is much lower than we initially thought. But there's still sort of a long way to go. Yeah, so once again, so those JC listed companies that we analyzed, we used only basically like we used only sort of what the information that was publicly available. So this was either through sort of annual reports or sustainability reports, or whatever information was available on the company's websites. So this includes sort of the climate policies, if they had any, or any environmental policies, as well as some companies would have sort of climate change reports. So as I had said initially, sort of when we had started the research, there were only 13 of the companies, there were only 13 JSE listed companies that were listed as formal supporters, with 6 of them being local companies and 7 having primary listings overseas, and the JSE listing being sort of a secondary one. But once again, almost half of those 55 companies that we had sort of analyzed either had a TCFD report, or they aligned their existing reporting suite to the framework, or were in the process of beginning the journey with the framework. So things weren't as sort of dire as we had expected. Oh, I think I actually showed an older slide. Sorry, my apologies. This slide basically just shows how, like as I mentioned earlier, although there's sort of we're still starting sort of with climate related financial disclosure in South Africa. But so this slide just shows that some indications that the disclosure is quickly gaining in prominence locally. I won't go into this because I feel like I've been sort of rambling. So I'll just skip over to this next slide, or the last slide basically, that just shows this would be sort of, so if the slide before this showed sort of some of the indications that there's an improvement in sort of the TCF or just disclosure. This would show sort of some of the barriers that that might sort of be standing in the way of a more widespread disclosure of climate-related information. Yeah, so I won't go into this too much either because I think I was supposed to be really quick, but I ended up talking too much because I like my voice. Yeah, so I think that is it from me, Adrian.